Go.
Okay. Hi, welcome to Radio Axiom. This is Session.19. In support of World Press Freedom Day, which was May 3rd, we are having a panel discussion. Our moderator today is Barbara Zaragoza. Thank you, Barbara. And she'll be discussing border issues and journalism specifically. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back with some live music after the discussion. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for having us. Again, my name is Barbara Zaragoza, and I am the author of San Ysidro and the Tijuana River Valley, and I'm also the author of Fronterizos, a history of the Spanish-speaking people in the South Bay, San Diego. I'm a freelance writer who has written for many different outlets, including San Diego Reader, also at the border. But my main focus that always interests me most is how did we get here in terms of the border? And so looking at that history has been the most important. I'd like to introduce our two panelists a little bit. I'm going to give a bio of both of you first, and then you'll fill in some of the blanks for me. We are here with managing editor of Truth or Fiction, Brooke Binkowski. And Brooke has worked as a journalist for more than 20 years, focusing mostly on humanitarian and post-conflict stories. She's written for CNN, NPR, CBS, and the Wall Street Journal, and most recently was the managing editor of Snopes. Brooke's work has taken her from the Bolivian mountains to Gibraltar's marinas and beyond. But her great love is the border regions and the lives that make those areas unique. She has expertise in immigration and migration, conflict and post-conflict areas, and since 2015 has distinguished herself as one of the leading journalists working against disinformation and propaganda. Brooke has won widespread recognition and multiple awards for her work over the years, including the Sunshine Award, which honors efforts to make government more transparent and hold elected leaders accountable. She lives in San Diego. So thank you for being here. And our other panelist here is Laura Castaneda. Laura Castaneda is an award-winning journalist, blogger, documentary filmmaker, media instructor, and career builder with over 25 years of experience in various multimedia platforms. Laura previously taught on the in the radio TV film department at San Diego City College for almost 20 years and served as department chair from 2010 to 2017. Prior to her position at City College, she worked in 3 different news markets, Chicago, San Diego, and Tucson, Arizona, and spent many years working on both sides of the international border in Nogales and Tijuana. Laura has held positions such as writer, assignment editor, field producer, reporter, and news anchor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so I'm wondering if you would like to fill in some of the blanks for me, give yourself an introduction, and then also in terms of press freedoms at the border, I'm wondering if we can start out by having you each talk about one particular incident that you may remember that was so powerful for you while you were a journalist at the border.
Oh God, I tried a lot of those. Well, you were actually, that bio was pretty thorough, and I can't remember if I wrote that, but if I did, I probably had a couple of drinks because that's that's a lot more than I usually write about myself. But yeah, as far as one experience at the border, my most recent aggravation at the border has been getting harassed, coming back. I haven't been harassed going into Mexico, just into the United States, so I guess thank goodness for small blessings. But I will think of so many throughout the course of this discussion. There's just so many. One of my strongest memories in recent months was I went and visited the caravan right before the United States started shooting tear gas the night before. And they were telling me about a march they were going to do to the border. And I remember saying, you probably shouldn't do it. You don't understand how bad it is right now in the United States. The rhetoric's up, like something horrible will happen. And they said, well, why would anybody shoot at children and women, So I mean, at least it wasn't bullets, I guess. That's like the only thing I have. Like, it was only tear gas, you know, a chemical weapon that is banned in wartime, but over an international border into a sovereign country. So, I mean, these are very strong things. I also have some great experiences that unfortunately are overshadowed by the more recent bad ones. But the bio is good.
So you mentioned documentary filmmaker in there, and I will tell you that just having covered the border in Arizona and in California for so many years as a TV reporter, you get a chance to tell a story in 90 seconds. So it's really hard to go in depth with any story that you write for regular TV local news. And it was actually, I had just moved to San Diego to work for KGTV Channel 10 when Blanco Ornelas got shot from Zeta. And at that time in the late 90s, there was a group of us. There was a border, just like there's a White House correspondence group, there was a border correspondence group from all the outlets that used to cover a lot of Tijuana, and I was one of them. So I remember covering that extensively, you know, and I saw that it just popped up on Netflix now, a series, you know, about that. And also, I was in Arizona when Colosio got shot here, and I remember watching it on feeds, you know, the ABC News feed, watching the reporters here in San Diego try to cover it, and unfortunately, without mentioning names, the ABC station here did a horrible job covering that story because they didn't even have very many Spanish speakers in the newsroom. And then...
Remind us what year that was and who he was a little bit.
He was the presidential candidate that was with the PRI. And he was the front runner. He was allegedly chosen, handpicked to become president in Mexico. And his family lived in a small town about 3 hours south of Tucson, Arizona. That's where they were from. I can't remember the name now, I'm not prepared, but because I was working on the American side in Arizona at the time, that news director got it, and they absolutely sent me to his hometown to go when he was campaigning. I covered him as a candidate, and then when the shooting happened and he died, I covered
What year was that?
I want to say it was, let's see, I got to San Diego in 95, so it had to be 94 maybe? 94? Correct me if anybody knows differently. My memory doesn't serve me that well anymore, but I covered his funeral. That was an extraordinary experience as a journalist, American journalist, of a Mexican-American journalist, to go down there and cover that story. And then 6 months later, his wife died of pancreatic cancer. And so once again, I went to cover her funeral too. So that whole dynamic was just personally amazing for me, just amazing in a horrible way, but it really was eye-opening about the way stories are covered along the border and how much misinformation comes over the border. And then with the documentary, which we can talk about later, because I know Brooke has a lot to talk about too, I ended up doing a documentary during the second round of the San Diego wildfires, because I noticed that the media here was not mentioning any of the border crossers that died. If you look up and Google how many people died in the San Diego wildfires in 2007, you'll see that the county of San Diego shows that 4 people died. But it wasn't 4, there was 11, because 7 of them were undocumented. So I ended up doing a documentary called The Devil's Breath, El Aliento del Diablo, and I think it's on YouTube now, but that was probably, you know, I hope when it's my time and I go, people remember me for that work, because I think that was something that I invested the most time and skill into telling the truth about what really happened.
Well, my next question actually is, we're talking about history now, we're going back to the 1990s and things, and part of my research has been interviewing a lot of Chicanos from the Chicano movement during the civil rights period, 1960s, especially the 1970s. And what we do know is that this issue of immigration And this issue of the border and the spotlight in the border has been here for decades. And what we saw was in the 1970s, right here, we're in San Ysidro right now, about 10 blocks away from the San Ysidro port of entry. It is the largest land port of entry in the world, with approximately 50 million people going through every single year. And what we had in 1979 and 1977 were protests at the border against white supremacy, and then also against Carter, because Carter wanted to set up a chain link fence along the border from the Pacific Ocean to San Ysidro. And people were protesting that, and they called it the tortilla curtain. And then, of course, as we go along in history, we know that in 1994, Clinton was the one who created Operation Gatekeeper, and he was the one that created the first military landing map, the first wall, if you will, and bumped up a lot of the border patrol security surveillance. Then we had 9/11, and George W. Bush created a secondary wall. And that was approximately 300 feet from the other wall, and it spanned again from El Paso to the Pacific Ocean. And there was continuous construction. Then with President Obama, we did call him, or many of us knew that he was called the Deporter-in-Chief. And so what I do wonder now is, have things changed since 2016? And how have things changed since 2016 in terms of journalism and what we focus on at the border? And are things worse, or are we just more aware?
I think you've been out there a lot more than I have.
I would say it's unquestionably worse. I mean, it was bad before, but it's worse now. I mean, we've got concentration camps. There's nothing, I mean, you can't really call them any other name but concentration camps, right? I mean, they are camps in the desert and elsewhere where a certain perceived ethnicity of asylum seekers are concentrated. And, you know, you can pretty it up and call them detention centers or immigration detentions. You can call the people in them immigrants or immigrant children, but really what they are is asylum seekers who are looking for safety, and now they're being killed and beaten and drugged and raped and molested and incarcerated for no reason. So yes, things like this happened before, but the scale is incredible, and the amount of vulnerable people who have been treated horribly, who are being treated horribly, it has gone way up. Also, the harassment of journalists and lawyers and activists is, again, it's nothing new. The secret list of enemies to the Border Patrol is nothing new, but what's new is the scale and the enthusiasm with which border agents have sort of taken on this mantle of harassers.
I would echo all of that, and I would just say that I have not personally been out there as Brooke has been, but my students have been out there. I have taught border reporting at 2 different universities or colleges. I know there's only 5 universities that I'm aware of in the southern United States where students are learning how to cover the border and getting any kind of education in border journalism. Mm-hmm. So I have really pushed my students to get out there and go to the camps, talk to people, find out what's really happening, because with social media, there's so many untruths and so many lies coming out, and somebody in Minnesota sees that online and they believe it because the border's not close to them. They don't have conversations with people who really know what is going out there. So I think social media has just completely just soaked up so many untruths and lies and made up stories and twisted stories. And until people stop trying to believe what they think happened and they really, get the real stories from the real people who are out there and the real people that are living it, this is just going to spiral out of control, as it has. I've never, ever seen so much harassment against the media, and now there's so many more freelancers now than there were 15 or 20 years ago. You had a company that backed you up when you went across the border. Now there's so many freelancers that are using their phone. And so who do people believe? I think that's part of the story too. Who do you know what do you believe? Who, you know, who can you believe as a viewer or as a reader? And then that coupled with all the harassment and journalism organizations trying to protect their own, and the ACLU getting involved and attorneys getting involved, and you know, it's madness. I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I already had problems prior to 2016. I mean, it wasn't easy covering the border prior to 2016. I would make FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. We would wait months and months and months and then get information that seemed bogus. You know, we would get quotes that were strange that we couldn't, you know, people who had been put in the detention camps, why are they there? And we would get strange feedback back, and there's nothing quite that you can do. I mean, it was really a challenge already then. I remember, and the stories were also so heartbreaking then. And it just seemed as if though it was white noise though, that nobody was listening. I remember going down to Casa Migrante and talking to a woman during the Obama administration who had been deported. And she said that she had been working in Nevada for 21 years as a cleaning lady for a hotel. All of a sudden, 21 years, she gets to work at 6 in the morning. And ICE is there and deports her. And her 2 children, one a teenager and one something like 8 years old, is now stuck in their apartment without food, without rent money, without anything. And she's in the middle of Tijuana saying, I can't get back and I don't know what to do, and my children are up there. And so these were the kinds of stories that were already taking place, and we were able to tell it, but it just seemed as if though there wasn't that much interest. And now suddenly there is a lot of interest. There is a huge amount of interest in the civil rights of immigrants, and yet it feels like we're absolutely impeded from telling those stories. And so that's where it takes me to tell a little bit more history to the audience. A lot of this about press freedoms at the border specifically came out at NBC7 Investigates. You know this article, yeah. Leaked documents show the U.S. government tracking journalists and immigration advocates through a secret database. I want to read a little bit to the audience about the background so that they know what happened. At the end of 2018, roughly 5,000 immigrants from Central America made their way north through Mexico to the United States southern border. The story made international headlines. As the migrant caravan reached the San Ysidro port of entry in South San Diego County, which is about where we are now, so did journalists, attorneys, and advocates who were there to work and witness the events unfolding. But in the months that followed, journalists who covered the caravan, as well as those who offered assistance to caravan members, said they felt they had become targets of intense inspections and scrutiny by border officials. One photojournalist said she was pulled into secondary inspections 3 times and asked questions about who she saw and photographed in Tijuana shelters. Another photojournalist said she spent 13 hours detained by Mexican authorities when she tried to cross the border into Mexico City. Eventually, she was denied entry into Mexico and sent back to the United States. So now documents leaked by NBC7 show that their fears of being tracked weren't baseless, that their own government had listed their names in a secret database of targets where agents collected information on them. Some had alerts placed on their passports, keeping at least 2 photojournalists and an attorney from entering Mexico to work. And so that's really the background information, and they provided the documentation where they actually have this San Diego Sector Foreign Operations Branch. And it looks like something from the McCarthy era. Migrant Caravan, fiscal year 2019, suspected organizers, coordinators, instigators, and media.
I was incredibly disappointed that I wasn't on that list and that I wasn't as an instigator. Like, if I find out that I'm on some list as an instigator, I will be so excited. Like,
well, what could you do? What would you do if you found out you were on that list?
Tell everybody. That's about it. I've got a big mouth. I mean, what can you do? It's, I mean, I know I'm on some list somewhere because I have not crossed once in the past since 2017. No, I'm sorry, I've crossed once where they have not sent me to secondary. And they told me that my passport was flagged for unknown reasons. First they said I was crossing too much, then I said I wasn't crossing enough, then they said it was random, then they said it wasn't random, that I had to FOIA my own name to find out more, and then they stopped explaining anything to me and just started screaming at me to shut my mouth. I mean, this was like subsequent times that I crossed, so eventually I stopped crossing, which I'm super not proud of. I hate it, but I also am really concerned that with the escalation tactics that it will escalate further.
So it's really had a chilling effect on you?
Oh, yeah,
Really?
absolutely. And you know, what's funny is I was telling people about this. I kept saying, you know, I'm being singled out, I'm being targeted, there's a flag on my passport, something is happening, my car is being searched every single time, they're harassing me to get me to stop crossing. And I would tell people this, and they'd be like, yeah, sure, you know. In fact, I had one person who I thought was a friend say, you know, I'm really worried about you, I think you're mentally ill, and like imagining people are like harassing you at the border. She's like, I know it feels very real to you. I didn't talk to her again after that. I was so infuriated, but then I thought, oh my God, am I nuts? So I didn't really talk about it that much. And then I started hearing about more and more of this harassment, and so then I really got angry. In fact, one of the people on that list took pictures of me for an article, and we started talking about it. I'm like, thank God I'm not crazy. She's one of the people who came forward.
Well, just this morning, there was a freelance journalist, right, that tweeted this whole episode. It was like a series of 7 or 8 tweets. I'm sorry, I forgot his name.
Nate Abarea.
And he was completely frisked, harassed. They, you know, full gamut. But he felt he was mistreated 10 times over. And he tweeted the whole thing after he crossed. Which I think there was a time, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was a time when journalists felt like they were protected, like they didn't have to fear that treatment. And now there's no such thing anymore.
It feels very close to some kind of horrible thing. I mean, oh man, I shouldn't even talk about this. It sounds so crazy, but I'm going to. I had this very strange a very strange series of experiences in 2014 and 2015 in Mexico after I was doing stories about human trafficking, where I would be walking down the street, like on Revolucion or something, and I would look over and there'd be some guy in a car with a newspaper like this, but looking at me. Or somebody would come out of an alley and shoulder check me. And it was, over time I realized it was like the same 3 people, and I'm like, what is even happening? Maybe I'm just going nuts, you know, maybe I'm just losing it. So I didn't really talk about it that much. I mean, I talked about it at home, I talked about it to my partner, like, hey, if something happens, here's where I am, you know, like you have to be careful with that sort of thing anywhere if you think you're being followed. But of course, there's always that sense of self-doubt. And it wasn't until 2017 when that story came out about Pegasus being used to track journalists' phones that I was like, holy crap, I got one of those texts. I thought it was from a source, and there was a link. So I click on the link, nothing happens. I'm like, oh, well, you know, going about my day. So I'm like being, it's, you know, I mean, it's just
60
insane.
Minutes did an incredible piece about that, about the phone tracking.
Oh,
and
that was what they used to get Jamal Khashoggi.
Right.
And that's terrifying. Like that kind of thing now, especially finding out that the Mexican and American governments are now sharing intel on journalists. I mean, that is incredibly frightening.
Right, and I just wanted to say you're not crazy and read a little bit of this too, because the NBC 7 Investigates linked to a news gathering source where 103 organizations demanded border agencies end surveillance targeting journalists. But take a look at what they say here. I wanted to read this out because you're not crazy. In fact, look at what they're saying here. Patched together in the frenzied wake of the 9/11 attacks, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has grown into the nation's largest federal law enforcement body, absorbing 22 agencies, including CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE. The creation of DHS is one of, if not the largest government reorganizations since World War II, and arguably the most impactful for civil liberties since the Cold War formation of peacetime intelligence agencies such as the CIA or the National Security Agency. CBP, Customs, Borders, and Protection alone, now employs more than 60,000 employees, including nearly 45,000 law enforcement personnel, which is almost 3 times the number of sworn special agents at the FBI. ICE employs an additional 20,000 non-sworn employees. CBP and ICE also operate with enormous resources. For fiscal year 2019, President Donald Trump has allocated $14.4 billion for CBP and close to $8.3 billion for ICE, about 2.5 times the FBI's total budget for the same year. And then, moving forward, they say that leaked CBP slides dated January 9th, 2019 included photographs and biographic information of 59 activists, journalists, and lawyers, approximately 40 of whom are U.S. citizens.
There you go.
So we're talking about a massive kind of police force here at the border, and Border Patrol, whenever I've gone on tours with them, explain that they have quite a bit of authority within a 100-mile radius of the border, correct?
Of any border, which includes, by the way, water border, air border. So it's 100 miles from any border, so basically 2/3 of the country, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about Border Patrol and CBP, we're talking about employees who want to put bread on the table, right? I mean, that's why they get the job. But are they part of this, do we think that they're part of the entire, let's say, aura of the media and journalists are bad and we should be taking them to the side and they aren't really human and they're doing a disservice? I mean, what are we talking about here when we're talking about this kind of budget and this kind of manpower?
Oh, sorry.
I think there's definitely a new culture, and these two groups are being pitted against each other, because I know back in the day, just like any other source, you have a police source, or, I used to hate it when people would say, I hate the media. So I'm like, you know what? Don't stereotype us like that. I'm one of the good ones. There's good and bad of everything, right? So it used to bother me a lot when I would see that, or people would say that to me, and I would have to say that back in the day when I was out there, or what I teach students, is that not everybody that works for Homeland Security is the devil. But they are grooming this new culture of younger people that are being hired, that are coming in and telling them, you've got all this authority now. Those journalists can't tell you what to do. So I think there's this new kind of groups pitting against each other, and I don't see it getting better. I see it getting worse.
Yeah, well, in my experience with, I've received many tours by Border Patrol, which I'm grateful for. They have acted transparent, and I remember one tour where we were looking at sewage and there was a footprint in the mud, and the particular agent kept calling it. Look where it went, look where it was running, and was referring to the individual who had presumably jumped over the border wall and was running as in it. And then I had another tour of a retired Border Patrol person. He was not representing DHS, he was not representing CBP or Border Patrol in any way, shape, or form. He'd been retired for quite a number of years. But he was showing me the border, and it was so interesting because what he said is that he had been a young man who hated authority. And so he went into the Border Patrol precisely because he became the authority. And so now we have Border Patrol who, for the first time ever, endorsed a president, President Trump. And President Trump is saying that the media is the enemy of the people. Mm-hmm. And then we see this, and how do we combat this? How do we address this? I mean, having a chilling effect, it's certainly having a chilling effect on me, even psychologically. I have children. I don't want to be threatened. I don't want to die today. Maybe not yet. And so how do we combat this? How do we address this issue?
I think social media is a double-edged sword. I mean, it's not going anywhere. And actually, this is kind of one of my other things that I'm sure I'll get into later. But it's also potentially a powerful force for good. You can call people out. You can never underestimate the power of public humiliation where it's deserved. I am a big fan of publicly humiliating people who deserve it. I mean, I'm not saying like, random person on the street, like somebody with a swastika flag deserves it. An entity that is currently killing people and, gleefully and lying about it, they deserve it, that kind of thing. So never underestimate that power of the call out and getting people, agitated. I mean, I keep trying to tell myself this about the border stuff. I used to say that I would take all this time to gather a story. I'd go report, I would go, do all this stuff and interview people and put it together, and then I might as well just go like stick my head in a well and yell at what's happening because nobody cared. It was so frustrating. I would be talking to people in Tijuana and they would say, please tell our stories, and I'd say, yes, of course. And they'd say, why don't Americans hear our stories? I go, they do hear them. I don't know what's going on. It's like you might as well just yell at the clouds. So at least now people are aware of the extreme horrible things, the dehumanization that's been going on for a very long time culturally, and they're aware of this sort of dreadful treatment of migrant workers, immigrants, asylum seekers, undocumented people. Like I'm going through all these descriptors because there's so many different situations, but they all sort of get painted with the same brush, and it's, I keep telling myself, at least people are talking about it now. At least we have this. But that's it. Like that's it. But you have to be steadfast, I guess. And I don't know. I'm very conflicted about returning to crossing the border regularly because I want to, because I miss it. I miss Tijuana. I miss Mexico in general. I miss being able to leave the country and come back and not have to worry about getting imprisoned or having worse. But what can I do?
Well, can education play a role too? Journalism education?
It can, but I don't think it's in a place where it's not in a good place right now because, you would think that every university and college in this region or along the border would be super interested in making sure that they have curriculum for covering the border, but they don't. There's still schools that don't even have broadcast journalism programs or print journalism programs. So, and if you talk to longtime journalists like myself, why do you think I got into education after a while? The long hours, the bad pay. I mean, journalism used to be a field that people would get into because, you want to tell the truth and you want stories told and you're passionate about it, but you could also make a living. And now, you can make a living off of journalism. And so you have all these great journalists that are jumping ship and becoming public information officers for banks and for hospitals and for schools because they can make twice as much money and they work Monday through Friday and they don't have to be in danger. There's also, as far as what can we do, there still are journalism, there's advocates out there, journalism groups that are there to try to protect journalists, the Society of Professional Journalists, and a lot of the ethnic journalism organizations have national organizations, like the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the Asian journalists, the Black journalists, the Native American journalists, who try to advocate on behalf of journalists that are mistreated, but there's only so much they can do. I know NAHJ's headquarters are in Washington, so I think that they're probably closer to some of the, caucuses where they could probably try to set up meetings or try to get more attention for some of these issues that happen. But you do need somebody behind you. You can't fight that fight alone. I just saw another story. I read a lot of stories and see a lot of stories still. I don't remember where I saw it, but just what you were talking about, where the agent was calling somebody it came out because somebody called somebody out, which is what Brooke was talking about, an agent who, they had text messages from his phone, and he was referring to people with derogatory terms.
It's the same guy who ran over a Guatemalan man, right?
I don't remember if it was the same person.
He went after him with his truck, ran him down.
What was
And-
that? Oh, you want to?
Oh, sorry. He ran down a dude from Guatemala. I think in his like truck or his van. I think it's the same guy. It turned out he'd been saying all this, racist, dehumanizing stuff, and
Well, I'm curious too. There's two questions I have. The first is, you had mentioned the good things in Tijuana and the good things in the border and things, and there are a lot of great things happening. I mean, there's
Phenomenal.
there's
Phenomenal.
some great food in Tijuana and food here at the border that we love to talk about. There's some great people, some great cultural events and things. How difficult is it to write about the great things happening here and actually get them published? How interested do you think the media is, both locally here in San Diego and wider nationally, about some of the really rich border culture and people and events and things? Is that actually a hindrance because of this wall that we have here?
I would say that it's gotten better. And there is interest, but in a different way. Like, you're not going to convince somebody in Iowa or Minnesota to jump on a plane and come and visit in Tijuana. That's not going to happen. But I have seen in some of the magazines, when you're on a flight, like Southwest Magazine, they've done some really nice articles on the 5-star spas down in Baja, or the restaurants, or the art scene, or the music scene. I've seen some of that, on a broader scale. So I would say it's probably better in some sense. About 10 years ago, I had a show that was running for a short time on KPBS called Stories de la Frontera. And that was the mission of that show, was not to necessarily cover all the horrible things, because we know there's enough of that, but really to focus on some of the culture. And there's another show that runs on KPBS, Jorge Meraz's show, Crossing South, where his is more like a travel and leisure show, where he goes to different spots in Mexico, kind of close to the border, and talks to the people, the restaurant owners, the breweries, the travel places that Americans might want to go down and consider, the wineries and things like that. So I always tell my students, we can't ignore the hard news, bad stuff that happens, because people have a right to know about that. But you also have to show the other side. You have to.
My focus changed. I covered the border, by the way, for, I guess, probably about 15 years. Is that? Yeah, about 15. Oh my God. About 15 years. When I say stuff like that, I feel really old. And at first, I was trying to bring attention to the human rights violations going on at the border. That has always been a focus. But over time, I started trying to kind of present Tijuana particularly Tijuana, because it has such a bad reputation, in this sort of like different light, just kind of like, here's why it is the way it is. And then finally, my main goal now is, and has been for several years, to present Tijuana and the border as filled with people who are people, entire people unto themselves, who have thoughts and hopes and prayers and dreams. Some of them are horrible, some of them are great. They are humans, just like everybody else, and they've been so flattened. They've become these sort of caricatures, like people in Tijuana they're cartels, and they're, undocumented. I can't even bring myself to say the illegal word anymore. I hate that word. I hate it. It's vicious and it's inaccurate. That's like, what really annoys me is that it's completely inaccurate, and vicious. But I wanted to show, like, your average American Anglo, reader or listener or viewer, that we have more that unites us no matter where we are. Everybody's human. And I know that that's a really like sort of starry-eyed thing to say, but I felt like at least people on the border deserve that, to be presented as humans. And it's simultaneously the most simple thing and the most complicated thing to do, because your average like racist home, like person whose home is somewhere in the United States away from the border is going to be like, well, what about MS-13 and the cartels, and it's like, okay.
But you know what, in the same sense, think about what Mexicans must think of the United States right now. Mexicans, nationals. You can't go to a mall without worrying if you're going to get shot.
Gunned down, or
movie theater.
Or school.
I mean, that's where we're at.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, if you guys see me, by the way, looking real twitchy and I keep looking at the door, I have to do that now. Like, this is the kind of stuff I have to do all the time.
That's terrible.
It's
That's
awful.
terrible.
And I'm laughing about it because it's like, oh my God.
And yeah, Tijuana, I think, gets a bad rap a lot. There was a point where we were trying to set up a border blog with the Union Tribune, a project between San Diego City College and the Union Tribune. It didn't end up happening the way it was supposed to, but one of the big issues with the community college district was, well, the State Department said that, you know, Tijuana is one of the most dangerous cities and that, you know, we can't let students cross the border. So that became a big issue. And I always tell people when they ask me, because I get a lot of phone calls from people that are coming, journalists that are coming from other areas, they've never been down here, I don't speak Spanish. I'm from Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago, and I would tell this to anybody that's thinking about going down to Tijuana or to Durango or anywhere else in Mexico. Go with someone that knows the lay of the land. If you were going to Chicago, I would tell you the same thing. Go with someone who knows the lay of the land. It doesn't make sense to go into a strange place where you don't know the culture and the people, and certainly not if you don't speak the language. So I think I would say that to anybody, no matter where they're going, not just Tijuana, but Tijuanenses are different. They're not on the American side and they're not on the Mexican side, and Mexicans don't really consider Tijuana Mexico, and, you know, Americans that cross over think that that's Mexico, but it's really, the borderland is just so complicated, and it's rich in so many ways, and it's frightening in so many ways, but it's just an amazing place that just has so much to offer. And, you know, if you don't want to get in trouble, don't walk down a dark alley at 3 o'clock in the morning.
And don't walk out in the middle of a busy street and start looking for drugs and like little kids to buy. Like, there's so many garbage Americans who do exactly that. And they think they can get away with it because they're in Mexico, they're in Tijuana. And it's like, don't do that.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times when people come from even North County, now that I've lived here so long, or let alone somewhere else in the country, they'll ask me questions that just don't make any sense to me about the border, because we don't live that life. And what I find most troubling, I've noticed now living here, that the media, I'm thinking of, in particular, the series that I refuse to watch called Breaking Bad. And then, right? I mean, that's part of it. Is that there's a series, Breaking Bad, and then there's also, I think there is Hollywood. There is Hollywood things that are all. Yeah, I guess there's. It's when they present Mexico. They present it in no other form but something about drug dealing. And there was also this Hollywood movie that I saw, what's the name, with this family, this pretend family that goes down to Mexico, and there's an abuelita in this huge like drug dealing like complex and things. And this is the kind of thing that Hollywood is producing, is when we see something about Mexico, when we see something about the border, we're seeing this so that people don't know anything else except for these bizarre things. And so, you know, even if they're not trying to be racist or ethnocentric, they're asking me questions about the border where I'm looking and I'm thinking, boy, that's so outside the realm of my experience. You're speaking in a different language to me right now that I have not experienced. I can't even answer what you're saying. And I think that that's the other thing, is the flip side of the good things that are happening. And I'm happy to hear you say that there are good, there is good journalism about good things that are happening in Baja California and in Tijuana. I think you're right. Yeah, here in the border, it's come around. There is that backlash of, we're also going to talk about the good things. But you know, when it comes to the bad things, when it comes to the hard news, I think that's a frustration too, because in my opinion, and I'm wondering what you guys think, is, you know, right here at the border, we've got a sewage problem. We've got sewage coming down from Mexico into America. We've got an air pollution problem Here in San Ysidro, they're monitoring the air because of the border and the traffic. We've got a massive reconfiguration happening at the San Ysidro border. We're reconfiguring it and redoing it completely with the GSA. And all these topics, to me, seem extremely important, hard news, and they seem to go completely ignored, and the focus seems to be what CBP and what Border Patrol is doing, so that we've got no, like, daily life of hard news at the border.
Another major problem, I'm very upset about this, and it's very frustrating to me, and I'd love to see it stop forever, is there's at least 3 groups. There's Center for Immigration Studies, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and Numbers USA. These are 3 nonprofits. They're all related. They're part of what's called the Tanton Network, because John Tanton, who was this retired ophthalmologist, created them. They are currently being quoted and interviewed as legitimate experts on the border and on immigration. And what they actually are, which nobody seems to take the time to look into, is they're slightly rebranded population control groups with an eye to preserving, in John Tanton's own words, preserving a Euro-American majority in the United States, because they thought that Latin American cultures being inferior, this is what they said in their internal writings, should be kept from taking over the country. And because they have such high birth rates, because they're Catholic, they thought they would call it, they decided that was population control, should be immigration reform. And what they're doing now is staffing DHS. They have free reign, basically, to staff DHS. So there are a bunch of people right now who are running things, who are being quoted, like Mark Krikorian. He's quoted as the immigration expert. The man is a eugenicist. And it's extremely inappropriate for them to be quoted for any reason without anybody also noting what their history has been all along and what their creator, Tanton, was all about. And that's why white supremacist propaganda has been infecting the border discussion now, because these are the people who are being quoted. But because they're very available and they'll talk about it, they get quoted very regularly. In fact, Krikorian just had an op-ed in, I think, the Washington Post, or Wall Street Journal, one of those things. And it's like, could you at least note what they are? They're not hardline immigration reformers. They're freaking eugenicists.
And that really that bleeds over into education, into border journalism education, or journalism education, teaching your students not to just take somebody's word for something, but to really do the research and find out who you're quoting or who you're talking to. Just because somebody says they witnessed something, find out for real if the person you're quoting really knows what they're talking about, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that I've experienced over my career, and I see now a lot, is who's running the newsroom? Who is making the decisions about what coverage is allowed on that station or what, in that publication? And do you have the people on your staff that speak the language, that understand the culture, and that are going to pitch stories that count? The pollution, well, how many people does it affect? Do you have people to talk to? How can you pitch that story to make sure that that story gets on the front page and it's not buried, or that it's actually put on the broadcast? I've worked for people that said, oh, Americans don't care about that.
Oh yeah, me too.
CNN. Lights fell from a discotheque in Tijuana on the floor where a bunch of teenagers from the United States went dancing and drinking, and a lot of young Tijuana, clubbers went. Hundreds of people were injured. And, it was like, yeah, we could cover it. I mean, when you have that, instead of there were floods in Rosarito and people were dying. Why are we waiting? Get over there, or have a stringer that's already in Tijuana, a freelancer that you can call in the middle of the night and say, get down there. Not this resistance that, oh, people don't care about that. And what I would tell my bosses who I felt that way, let me take you down there. Let's go for a tour. Let me take you down there. Or build a relationship. The Mexican media and the American media has always gotten along in this region. And I had the same feeling about my colleagues when I worked in Arizona. The camaraderie across the border was great between the journalists.
I
It
love
just was,
journalists
you know.
so much.
But if you don't know where to go and you don't know who to talk to and you don't have people planted over there, you're going to miss the boat on the big stories. You can't wait. I just want to mention really quickly too, and jump in, Brooke, if I'm talking too much here, but the Media Arts Center, if anybody's familiar with the Media Arts Center San Diego, they are a nonprofit that helps independent filmmakers. And they do some youth groups where they teach young kids how to shoot and edit storytelling, basically. Well, they did for the first time ever, and it was sponsored by the Union Tribune, so I was happy to see them sponsor that, something called the Film Challenge this past year at the San Diego Latino Film Festival. And so they put a call out for I believe they were 3-minute short films. If anybody had 3-minute short films that had anything to do with the border, enter it. Well, there were dozens of amazing freelance journalists that came from everywhere to tell stories about the caravan and border stories. They were interviewing children and people and parents and, you know, getting the real stories out there. And some of those stories were better than anything I've seen on local news here.
Oh, God, yeah.
Well, you know, that's my last question, and then I know we should also open it up to some questions here from the audience. But you've probably had a lot of more exposure to Mexican journalists and their experience. Talk a little bit about how you think the American journalist experience at the border and the Mexican journalist experience at the border right now and in the past differs. What's your opinion on that?
That's actually a really interesting question, because it seems like at this point, the kind of level of harassment Mexican journalists have had crossing, at least around here, into the United States is kind of on a level with what American journalists are dealing with now. So they're kind of used to it, although they have told me, because I started discreetly asking around when I first thought I might just be nuts and I might like be imagining everything. And I was like, hey, has anything been happening to you guys when you cross? And a bunch of them said, yeah, it's been escalating for us as well. But, you know, I haven't crossed the border without having my card searched in 10 years. I'm like, oh, great. So this is what you've been enduring this whole time. You know, it makes me feel kind of mean and small, actually, to have not, like, realized that's analogous to what they were going through this whole time. But it is getting worse. It can always get worse.
And I would say that, again, having more experience in the 90s, I remember that the Reader interviewed Vicente Calderon, and they did an article. Vicente is a longtime journalist. He's actually worked in Los Angeles, but he is better known for being a journalist in Tijuana. And, you know, great colleague, known him for many years, and he said that he was baffled by the way American newsrooms would decide how they were going to cover news for the day, that he was kind of taken back by the near drownings and the number of stories about animals that are covered in the United States. And then also around that era, when I worked at Channel 10 as a reporter, we did an exchange, a 1-week exchange program with Canal 12, with Televisa. So one of their reporters, who is now a wonderful woman by the name of Lourdes Sandoval, who's the news director at Univision here now. At that time, she was a reporter at Channel 12 and Televisa. She went to Channel 10 for a week, and I went to Tijuana, to Canal 12 for a week. And the goal was just kind of do this interchange where you get to know not only the colleagues in the newsroom, but also to understand how they cover their news and how, you know, how their day works, basically. And it was an eye-opener for me, you know, as an American journalist, just seeing the way their system operates and vice versa. And after the end of the week, her and I talked about it a little bit, and she said the same thing. I cannot believe how many animal stories are covered here.
They don't cover animal stories? What do they cover instead?
A lot of education, a lot of politics, government,
So
They
serious
don't
stuff.
cover, well, they don't seem to cover the breaking news. They don't have that breaking news element that you see so much here with the banner, breaking news, you know, a house fire. I didn't see that there as much, you know, that breaking news element. Their stories were more in depth, a little bit more planning. They knew the night before what they were going to try to cover the next day.
But you can work that too. So one of my things that I've been trying to do lately is turn every trope, every newsroom trope against itself to get more coverage. Because now I know how it works, right? I've been doing it for a long time. Like now I'm kind of a rogue element, so I can do what I want more or less. But we used to say, you know, if you want something to get coverage, put up a picture of either a puppy or a woman with big boobs, or a woman with big boobs holding a puppy. Like that's the best of all. So that's like, you know, that's what gets coverage. Women with big boobs and puppies, sadly. Sorry, I can't stop saying it. But that was our joke, because it was like, you always had to have the kicker because everything's too serious for Americans. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because that brings us to not just the media and the government, but then our readers. And who are our readers and what's happening to American readers? And has it changed since 2016 or?
I have so much to say about this.
Oh, please, say it, yeah.
I'm sorry.
And you probably, rightly so, have a lot to say as the managing editor. You probably see all the hits and what people are reading and what people are not. Please, yes, tell us.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I switched my focus in 2016, not 2015, because I was still doing border stuff. I was all border all the time for probably about 10 years. I was a full-time freelancer. And then it became unsustainable. Freelancing just became financially just, you know, not good. Like I couldn't eat, I couldn't afford food, that kind of stuff. So I decided to get a job. I ended up getting a job as a fact checker for a fact-checking website. And I realized that there was a bigger problem that affected the border, among other, well, it affects the whole world. Disinformation, propaganda, fake news is what it's being called, which is, I don't like the term, so I say disinformation. And the way news is read and consumed and the way it is treated now in the post-2016 world is very different. I mean, people were never really good at reading stories anyway. You know, they'd skim them. Everybody's busy, you know, nobody has time. But now it's just hit this fever pitch where people will read the headline and the subhead, and that's it. And then they'll pass the story along. Doesn't matter if it's old, doesn't matter if it's BS, if it's got a catchy headline, picture of a puppy, people will pass it around.
Well, the other thing is, you said earlier, social media is a double-edged sword. My children, I think they spend way too much time on those phones. I can see them on their phones right now. We are constantly bombarded with, you know, everything and the swiping, right? So I was happy to see that Snapchat started these little news briefs, because at the end of the day, I know we want limits about what children can see online, but I was happy to know that at least if my teenagers are on their phone so much and they do use Snapchat, that they'll at least know the headlines. And I probably talk too much about news to my own children. I know I certainly do to my students. And when they come into the classroom and we're having discussions and they don't know about that big story that everybody's talking about, that concerns me. So I think social media can be good for that. Instagram, it now has live TV. Facebook is being used a lot for journalism, as Brooke knows. And it can be a good thing, you know, when people are in danger and they can do a Facebook Live, which I've seen, saying, you know, somebody's, you know, after me. That's a good thing, right? You can get the information out quickly as long as it's true, as long as the information is true and it gets spread like wildfire, and somebody, if there's a missing child, you know, can get zapped out on all different platforms, and you have an opportunity or a chance to save someone's life or to make a difference in the community. You know, somebody that needs help medically, you see some stories done, and GoFundMes go out there and people get the help they need. But it's not good when the stories are not true and they also spread like wildfire.
So I don't know how much anybody knows about my history, or if anybody's been following this sort of Facebook doing like pushing disinformation in its algorithms. With its algorithms for engagement numbers, they're trying to hack society, they're trying to hack people. But basically, I was managing editor at a website called Snopes, which is a fact-checking website. I ran it for 3 years. During that time, we partnered with Facebook to try to help with the disinformation on their platform. I became aware pretty early on that they were not really going to do anything about it. And then I found out, because of my contacts with refugees and asylum seekers and groups representing them, about Facebook's role spreading disinformation in Myanmar, which sparked what is a genocide, basically. Like, I think they're still at the level of calling it ethnic cleansing in the global community, like in the international rescue community, and the God, I'm just rambling. I should have eaten more. Thank you. The sort of, humanitarian communities all across the world. I was in contact with them. I'm still in contact with a lot of them. And they were telling me about social media's role, specifically Facebook's role in Myanmar, and what was happening to Rohingya Muslims and the stories that were being spread to justify them. So I took it to Facebook because I had a line into Facebook. And I said, you guys have got to do something about this. You brought us on to combat disinformation. And this is major disinformation, and it's taken to this is a perfect example of what it can do. Yeah. And Facebook basically blew me off. They were like, whatever, I had meeting after meeting with them about other things, and every single meeting I would bring up Myanmar. I'd say, well, what about Myanmar? I got obsessed with it. I was miserable about it. I was sick over it for at least a year. And in that year, I got fired. Actually, I got fired after about a year and a half of complaining about Myanmar, and there were other issues as well, like Facebook trying to give us money, and I wouldn't take it. If you have heard any stories about somebody like whistleblowing about Facebook and saying that they believe that Facebook was spreading disinformation specifically as part of their business model on behalf of authoritarian regimes, that was me. So I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I'm seeing it happen on the border. I'm seeing it happen in Mexico. I mean, I'm seeing it happen all over the world, but I'm also seeing these algorithms, I did not say any bad words, these algorithms are being used specifically, and it has to be, at this point, it has to be done deliberately. They are spreading and holding on to disinformation about our region because it gets them numbers. And I mean, last night, the Nancy Pelosi thing,
Can you give us an example of the disinformation you've seen at the border specifically?
Oh, yeah.
Just one or two, so that we have some examples.
Oh, okay. There's the Islamic prayer rugs that were found at the border. There were no Islamic prayer rugs found at the border. There are some mosques, some masjids in Tijuana. And this is a really personal one because I accidentally started this rumor. I did a story about Muslims in Tijuana. I thought it was really interesting. There's a small but cohesive community of Muslim people. And in fact, I think there's a few. And I went and interviewed some of them, and I talked to them, and I said, why are you here? How did you end up here? How did you end up this and that? And it was just this interesting social story, like what is changing and why it's changing, and who is behind it, and what is, it's just like this sort of demographic change, And then it got picked up and picked apart by all the racist disinformation purveyor types, all the fearful xenophobes, and they were like, Muslims in Tijuana. So this morphed and mutated until prayer rugs are being found on the border, and the implication being that ISIS was coming in. And so that one has been a real persistent one because it sort of marries two xenophobic ideas together. That's a big one. Another one is that the caravans were funded by George Soros, who is a philanthropist who is also Jewish, and he's used as sort of like this uber Jew, like this, all the puppet master, weird anti-Semitic rumors that you would have heard about in the 30s and 40s are now being recycled, but because it's directed at an individual, it's George Soros now. So George Soros, this puppet master, who isn't, by the way, he's just a philanthropist, was apparently funding the caravan, according to these rumors. And he's also been funding MS-13,
Yeah,
so
it's
basically,
interesting.
Jewish
It's
people did it.
interesting because, the Amish are also in Tijuana now.
They won't
And
talk to me.
there's a large Amish group,
No,
and
nice.
even so, I don't think that they would get the same kind of disinformation campaign on them. And what is so fascinating from my history, of course, is 1882, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and people were so scared that the Chinese were going to invade via Mexico, and then World
bring
War
drugs.
II. Yeah, and then World War II, you had the Japanese were going to invade from the Mexican border, and then after 9/11, oh, the Muslims are invading, and do you know what country borders America to the south? And it's fascinating because it seems as if though there's some kind of historical rumor that somehow gets people really much more available in liking or spreading something, isn't it? Because they're not going to spread the
I don't think
Amish.
it's any surprise that a lot of the caravan stuff started right around the time when it was good for some political parties to have this horrible rush of immigrants about to storm the border. The timing was just too coincidental.
Right.
And I wish I had the time and the money to do a documentary to trace those buses and find out who paid for those buses and how people got here and was there a meeting? Were there posters spread around the town and somebody said, we're all going to start heading to the U.S.?
No, there was. There was actually a Facebook account in Honduras. It was a well-known politician, and he was a former TV presenter, very popular guy. I can't remember his name, of course. And he was saying, everybody, the caravan's going to be the biggest one yet. It's going to be great. It's all paid for. Everybody should go. And it was his official Facebook page. And then it was up. These posts were up for about 2 weeks. And then Facebook yanked it, and they said that it had been taken over by an individual who was not the person that it was representing. Somebody else had taken it over and was using it as a sock puppet. But they won't say why, they won't say who, and they won't say what happened exactly, but that was the impetus. Many, many people have been saying in the caravan, they're like, oh yeah, I saw this post on Facebook. So again, there's that social
It has
engineering.
to be looked into. It has to be
It
looked
has to
into.
be.
It's huge.
That's
That's a
where people
huge
get
part.
manipulated.
That's a huge part of the story that I have not heard anything about.
Disinfo.
Wow.
And a lot of it was also Trump. I know that because I talked to some of the caravan members. The most recent one, I was like, why did you decide to come now, especially now with the rhetoric? And they said, because of the rhetoric. Because Trump is saying, there's big caravans coming, and we keep hearing about it. And we're like, well, we might as well, Most of them are people who lived in the United States for most of their lives and they got deported. So most of these conversations I had were in English because they're like, oh yeah, well, I grew up in Tennessee, but I got deported to Honduras last year because of Trump, and Trump's now saying come back, so.
Yeah, the individual stories are so powerful and so interesting. We don't necessarily hear. And then what's the motivation of Facebook, and then also our freedoms and it's really challenging what we consider free speech. And there's so many issues that we could be talking about for another 2 hours. I want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions to the panelists as well, if anybody's interested.
Hi, my name's Jay. So I'm actually just trying to get into journalism. I was more on the activism side for a while, but a lot of activists, they don't really want to hear both sides of the story, and I do. But I just find journalism kind of frustrating because I need health insurance because I have health issues, and there's just not a lot of money in it like it used to be. And I tried writing for the school paper, but it's just people are so stupid. They just, like you said, they just care about animal stories. They don't want to hear about, the things that are going on at the border. And when they do, they don't put it in the context of, well, yeah, there's a lot of crime, but there's also a lot of crime in parts of the United States, and it's because of poverty and, complex political policy. I guess my question is, how do I kind of get into covering, what's sort of looking for, the border in Mexico, especially as a young student, and how do I not kind of get discouraged, and where's that line between ethics and being a journalist and an activist? One of my favorite border journalists is Charles Bowman. He's since passed away.
Who is it?
Charles Bowman.
Oh, okay.
But he kind of walked that line between activism and journalism, and it's I haven't really taken a lot of journalism courses because I'm more interested in the policy side, but I also just feel like I kind of need to take a step, and I kind of want to get my hands dirty. What's your advice to kind of get into the industry? I have a million questions, but
I would say just do it. There's so many people that talk about, I want to do this, do it. I don't know where you go to school. Where do
City College.
you go to City?
Yeah.
Get on the
City,
newspaper
cool.
staff, go to the digital journalism department, and tell them that you want to contribute stories. And if they don't like your stories that you're pitching, then go somewhere else. You can still be a student there, and you can still pitch stories for the Reader. You can pitch stories for City Beat. You can pitch, if you're willing to do the work, even if your writing is not perfect yet, somebody will, latch on to what you're doing. And they're not going to pay you a whole lot of money at the beginning, but the better you get at your craft and the more you are willing to build a name for yourself as this type of journalist or that type of journalist, the rest will come. And you know what else? You have the power of blogging. If nobody wants to hear your stories, I have a blog. I don't tell a lot of people because it's mostly, I call it realities and observations at the border. And I do it more for leisure than I do to try to publish my stuff. But if I pitched the story about the blind man that's over there singing every day, I don't know if anyone would take the story, but it meant something to me to stand there in the line and talk to him. So I blogged about it. So do your own thing. If nobody's biting, you do your own thing and get your work out there.
And regarding objectivity and advocacy, I can now say the stuff that I used to not say, because I spent a lot of time being as much as I could, being very middle of the road, very straightforward journalist, very, play by the rules, because I knew that at some point in my career I would stop doing all that. And I have now, and it's pretty liberating. But I also, it's happening during a time that journalism is changing dramatically. And what we're seeing is a lot of journalists, because of social media, are showing who they are as well as what they do. And what it has done it's sort of generated this conversation about objectivity and advocacy. And so I'm very, I don't like authority. I don't like authoritarianism. I don't like, inhumanitarian regimes. I don't like people, their freedom being encroached on, all that stuff. And I used to not be able to say that stuff. I used to feel like I shouldn't say that stuff. And now I'm like, if I'm talking about human rights, like basic human rights, if defending basic human rights are against my career as a journalist, then screw that. Then I'll be a freaking advocate. I'm sorry, I'm trying really hard not to swear. I got a mouth like a sewer. But the rules are changing dramatically, and people are going back to the original, or one of the original ways journalism was. So this sense of objectivity, like this idea that you have to be totally objective, you can't be an advocate, you can't, do any activism whatsoever, is a product of journalism being funded by advertising, because journalists were instructed not to piss off advertisers for probably obvious reasons. It's where your money's coming from. And that sort of became embedded and ingrained in this sort of journalistic ideology where people are like, well, I gotta be objective. But there is no true objectivity. There is always more to the story. You can never be truly objective, not as a human being, So don't worry, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And you will find your voice if you haven't already. And just, like Laura said, she's probably the best person to talk to about that. You will find it, and you will rock it as long as you own it.
It's really about passion. It really is. I mean, there's only a certain number of jobs at the very top, but if you're hungry enough, young man, you can publish your own magazine or your own paper or your own something. I mean, your generation has it going on. That's what I tell my students. So don't feel like you have to latch on to their world. Create your own thing.
Yeah, and I do have a lot of hope that your generation sees things differently.
No pressure.
And you're going to be, and you're
Hope
really
and
going
pray.
to.
Hope and pray that
No,
you
but
do.
I really do see a new vision coming out, and so this new idea and forging something that's entrepreneurial, rather than waiting for someone to give you a job, you be the boss. You create your own job, and but I would say in terms of journalism, what we lack is observers. We need more observers, and that's what journalists do. And I find that as an observer, that's the biggest form of activism and social justice that you can provide. And that's what I've always found. And that's a lot of times, all of the opinion columns and all of the talking heads on CNN and things. That's the thing that I miss, is I just miss the observer. And to me, those observers are the biggest social justice advocates, and as you go out and just talk to people.
But you can't be out there marching either. And I've had students that, I had a student who used to sing. I mean, he still does sing, not used to. He was Keno McQuinney was one of my students. He was the lead singer for Big Mountain, a reggae group. Yes, he's amazing. And he, for a little while, decided that he wanted to try broadcast journalism. And he had the perfect voice, and he had the presence, and he was great in that aspect for the performance part. But he was an activist. He was an activist at heart, and he posted a lot of things about activism, and I had to have that talk with him. And he came to terms with it eventually and realized that it wasn't going to work. And I do see a lot of journalists, even now, posting things that you wouldn't have seen 15 years ago.
I'm one of those.
And I would just say my best advice, because I'm still a little bit square like that, I'm not probably as bad as I was once taught, like, you know, straight down the line, no objectivity. But I would say keep politics and religion out. Nobody should know how you vote. Nobody should know what religion you are, and tell both sides of the story if there's two.
Oh, and I'd like to add to this that no matter what, somebody's going to tell you you're screwing up, you've lost all credibility, that, you know, you're hopelessly biased, you're hopelessly subjective, you don't know what you're doing. People tell you this probably they tell me this every day.
Yeah.
Screw them.
Just like one last thing, is like that's what I'm afraid of people, because of my past in activism, is like you can't be objective, you can't be a journalist, because I've had people tell me that.
They're wrong. Sorry.
I think you can bring something to the table that other people can't. But in your work, nobody should know where you lie. That's all.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, the horrible truth, though, is that you will not ever get rich as a journalist. I'm sorry. Yeah, yes, that part is possible. But trust me, when your rich friends are all going out to do something cool and you're like, I think I'll just stay home, it can be a little embarrassing. That's why I don't have any rich friends anymore.
But you can also do something else and freelance on the side. You can always do that.
Well, thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. And
Has it-
thank you very, very much
We done already?
for being here. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. And now I believe we'll have some music.
Yeah, go ahead and tell them what's next to the camera.
Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for your time. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for being here. Up next, we will have 4 live music performances. We're at the front, down in San Isidro. Thank you